Well, hello, everybody. In the interest of time, we're going to get started because I know that this will be an interesting discussion, and we'll have lots to say afterwards. So we'll get going. As most of you, I think, are aware, Old Dominion University's strategic plan emphasises providing students with the tools to succeed, among other things. And one of the things that we want them to succeed in is being able to read and write. I mean, I think they can do that after a fashion when they arrive. But there's reading and reading, just as there is various forms of writing. Today's topic is defending the possible, teaching students to love to read. And it's going to shine a light on our campus effort overall, which will keep informed, literate, active, and engaged citizens of our students, of our alumni, as they develop. Today's conversation is going to be led by Tim Siebels, who's Associate Professor of Creative Writing, and he's the author of several books of poems. And if any of you have ever had the pleasure of listening to Tim recite some of his poetry, it really does give, but when you then read it, you can hear his voice in the poems after that. So it's a great experience, and look forward to hearing some of your work today. Tim is a former fellow of the National Endowments for the Arts. He's been a writing fellow at the Provincetown Fine Art Works Center in Massachusetts, and his work has been featured in a number of anthologies. Most recently this year, where he achieved some considerable accolades for which we congratulate you. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, and he's going to tell us how to teach students to love to read. Thank you.
I want to start by reading just a few things to you. And I hope it'll make sense as I make my case for a particular approach to how to get people to read. And also, while I'm thinking about it, though, I'll remind you in a little while, when we do actually start to talk, you'll have to have the microphone. You can't just, even though I can hear you, they're trying to record it for all of posterity. So you'll need to have the mic, so we'll just have to slow down enough to get the mic. All right. This is a brief passage from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and it's from chapter 2 of The Liberty of Thought and Discussion. The time, it is to be hoped, is gone by when any defense would be necessary of the liberty of the press as one of the securities against corrupt or tyrannical government. No argument, we may suppose, can now be needed against permitting a legislature or an executive not identified in interest with the people to prescribe opinions to them and to determine what doctrines or what arguments they shall be allowed to hear. This aspect of the question, besides, has been so often and so triumphantly enforced by preceding writers that it needs not be specially insisted on in this place. Though the law of England on the subject of the press is as servile to this day as it was in the time of the Tudors, there is little danger of it being actually put in force against political discussion, except during some temporary panic when fear of insurrection drives ministers and judges from their propriety. This is a flash fiction by Brett Lott. It's called Night. He woke up. He thought he could hear their child's breathing in the next room, the near silent, smooth sound of air in and out. He touched his wife. The room was too dark to let him see her, but he felt her movement, the shift of her blanket and sheet. Listen, he whispered. Yesterday, she mumbled. Why not yesterday? And she moved back into sleep. He listened harder, though he could hear his wife's breath, thick and heavy, next to him. There was beneath this the thin frost of his child's breathing. The hardwood floor was cold beneath his feet. He held out a hand in front of him, and when he touched the door jamb, he paused, listened again, heard the life in his child. His fingertips led him along the hall into the next room. Then he was in the doorway of a room as dark, as hollow as his own. He cut on the light. The room, of course, was empty. They had left the bed just as their child had made it, the spread merely thrown over bunched and wrinkled sheets, the pillow crooked at the head. The small blue desk was littered with colored pencils and scraps of construction paper, a bottle of white glue. He turned off the light and listened. He heard nothing, then backed out of the room and moved down the hall back to his own room, his hands at his sides, his fingertips helpless. This happened each night, like a dream, but not. What Bugs Bunny said to Red Riding Hood. Say, good looking, what brings you out this way amongst the fanged and the fluffy? Grandma, huh? Some old bag too lazy to pick up a pot, too feeble to flip a flapjack? And you all dolled up like a fire engine to cruise these woods? This was your mother's idea? She been living in a Cracker Jack box or something? This is a tough neighborhood, mutton chops. You got your badgers, your wild boar, your hardcore grizzlies, and lately this one wolf's been acting pretty big and bad. I mean, what's up, Doc? Didn't anybody ever tell you it ain't smart to stick out in wild places? Friendly? You want friendly, you better try Detroit. I mean, you're safe with me, sweet cakes, but I ain't a meat eater. You heard about Goldilocks, didn't you? Well, didn't you? Yeah, well, little Miss Sunshine, little Miss I'm so much cuter than thee, got caught on one of her sneaky porridge runs, and the three bears weren't in the mood. So last week, the game warden nabs Baby Bear, passing out her fingers to his pals. That's right. Maybe your mother should turn off her soaps, take a peek at a newspaper, turn on some cartoons for Pete's sake. This world is about teeth, Bubble Buns. Who's biting and who's getting bit? The nerve of that broad sending you out here looking like a ripe tomato. Why don't she just hang a sign around your neck? Get over here and bite my legs off. Cover me with mustard. Call me a hot dog. All right, now stop. Listen, Red, I'd hate for something unpleasant to find you out here all alone. Grandma Schmanma, let her call Domino's. They're paid to deliver. Besides, Toots, it's already later than you think. Get a load of that chubby moon up there. You can't count on Casper tonight either. They ran that potato head out of town 2 months ago, trying to make friends all the time. He makes you sick after a while. Look, Cinderella, I got some candles and some cold uncola back at my place. What do you say? Got any artichokes in that basket? Anyway, we already know why reading is important. It can sharpen critical thinking skills, deepen the capacity for empathy, intensify the life of the imagination, all crucial features of a lively interior life. I often tell my students, no democracy can be sustained by an emotionally vacant and dim-witted population. Such a population is far more suited to a fascist society, where for the most part, you are told what to think and know you better not think anything else. But the central question for our conversation today is, of course, is it possible to teach students to love to read? My honest answer is there is no blanket answer to that question. One of the reasons I began this conversation by reading aloud is that I believe my own love of reading, both as a child and as a college student, was rooted in listening to people read aloud. First my mother, and years later, a number of my professors. It was listening to good readers read that put me on the path to become a lover of words and books. In essence, I'm talking about inspiration. Taking in the spirit of stories, essays, poems, plays through a living voice. For example, when I was reading the Mill, John Stuart Mill piece, some of you have probably seen On Liberty. And you know that Mill is fond of the 10,000 word sentence. And when I was reading Mill in college, as a sophomore, I think it was, I just didn't know how to read it. It's just, the syntax was just too complicated. But I had Dr. Hayne, I think his name was, a real kind of a radical guy of sorts. And he would read passages to us. And that changed my relationship to that text. It just did, you know. Let me go on. I find little reason to discuss techniques for reading improvement if the students don't feel some kind of real thirst for what books can offer. In other words, it's hard to teach someone if they feel no particular investment in the subject. When I read aloud to my students, I'm hoping for several things. One, I want them to witness my own pleasure in reading to see that it is more than drudgery. What I've found is that because I grew up in a time when there were only, in some cases, 3 television stations, a lot of times what we did for fun was read. I mean, you know, there was nothing on television, so you'd get a book and you'd read, and we thought of it as fun. I'm not sure that the generations, more recent generations of students, given video games, 2,000 television stations and so on, see reading as anything other than something you do for school. You know, it's a chore that you deal with. Whereas, you know, my mom would say, "You're bored? Go to the library." And I'd be like, "All right, let's go to the library," you know? I think it's different now. 2, if I read well, I believe that on some level, students who are listening will want to read the way I do. Or the way I do, rather. Which means they will be moved to reread for practice. I think I have 1 or 2 students in here. I know Matt's in here. But I rant and rave often about reading aloud, and I do it, of course, when dealing with poetry, of course, so much of poetry is rooted in song, so you want the words to actually take to the air. But beyond that, it's a different relationship with language altogether to give it voice. And I don't mean that by any means exclusively in poetry. But if you read well, and I had some great professors who were readers, some of whom were writers, but some were not. They were just people who loved to read aloud. And you couldn't help but want to sound the way they did when you read. You know, you couldn't help it. I mean, at least I couldn't. The third thing I'm thinking when I read aloud, because it is often the case that things read in silence become more clear when heard, I believe that the level of engagement in the classroom will increase. 4, because I've set the precedent, when I ask students to read aloud, they will simply see themselves on a continuum with me, both in the physical act of reading and in the less visible act of contemplation. 5, and if my sense of a text reveals something surprising or worthwhile for the discussion, I believe that too will inspire students to pursue more in their reading lives. I mean, I guess I should say there are a lot of ways you can approach this, and hopefully as we talk, you guys will, of course, come up with or give me different ideas. I thought for a while about talking about writing as a way of teaching reading also, and that is possible. The shortcoming of that, however, is that if a student is not necessarily passionate about writing, it's difficult to use one thing that the student is not especially passionate about to teach something else that they're not that passionate about, you know? And because most everybody, certainly in schools, high schools as well as colleges, most people have an investment in learning to read or reading well because you're going to have to read. I mean, if nothing, no matter what subject you're in, you're going to read. I think it's easier to go with something that's focused exclusively on reading as a baseline. I mean, again, when I was a creative writing emphasis person in the 70s, the teachers would read to us a lot, but I really, really, really wanted to be a poet. You know, I really wanted to be a writer, so I was, that meant a lot to me, to hear them read and hear the life in the language. And so when they give us texts of various kinds to read, I was reading them as someone who wanted to be a writer. And that's a very different way of learning literature. I mean, if you think about words as possibly your lifeline, you're going to read them with a different kind of investment. That's why if this was about teaching creative writers to read, that's a much easier actual discussion. But just if you're talking about reading in general, it's a little more complicated. So that's my basic idea about teaching students to love to read. Now, if it was just a matter of teaching someone to read, that's a very different discussion too. But loving to read, that's a pretty high goal, especially if you don't have a gift for it or whatever. If you weren't someone who just took to words like a fish to water. It's not easy to make someone love it, but the ways in which I have myself been moved to love language are all wrapped up in hearing people read. And I worried, of course, that people would say, and some of you may still say, but I teach history, I can't read, I teach this, that. But you can always read stuff aloud. I really do think so. In fact, some of my favorite history teachers were people who did, in fact, read passages from this person's speech or this or that and made it feel alive in the moment. And I think something we forget, especially those of us who are lucky enough to be pretty well educated, to have backgrounds, being surrounded by people who are educated, we forget that reading, is a relatively recent development in human society. People weren't reading 10,000 years ago, right? The language evolves about 5,000 years ago. We start finding scribblings and writings of various kinds, right? So I think maybe the human voice and the ways in which we use inflection in reading might go back to something deep and primal in us. May fix on an aspect of language that just simply sitting with a text cannot. And this is not to say, that one can't just love being in silence with a text. But I do think to the extent that you struggle a bit with reading, I think the more you can find the voice in the language, the more likely it is you'll find the life in the meanings and the life in the text. So that's why I would say, for me, the central thing is to hear text and to read text aloud. And that's basically the gist of what I have to say. But parenthetically, I should say, again, that the Literary Festival is coming up next week. Speaking of readings, right? And so, but I mean, partly I'm kidding, but mostly I'm really serious that, if you're in any position to send students to a literary festival event, by all means do, This is not to say that guarantees that when they come back they'll be, ready to read everything from A to Z. It just means that at least there's a reasonable chance that they will have encountered someone who is also really enthralled with language. And I can't help it. I do think that's kind of contagious at a certain point. I had one of my teachers, actually several teachers. I had a Renaissance English professor, who was like kind of a madman about John Donne and Shakespeare, both of whom I'm 19 years old. I didn't care much about Donne or Shakespeare. Truthfully, I knew they were important, but only in the sense that you are told that they're important, right? But he was a fiend. His name was David Dillon, Dr. David Dillon. And he would read that stuff, man, the Dark Lady sonnets and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, wow, man, there's got to be something going on in there. You know what I mean? And it wasn't necessarily because I got the meanings that he felt as he was reading them. It was because I was watching him, feel and be changed by this stuff he was reading. And as a consequence, I thought, I've got to go in there further. You know, I gotta get what he's getting, because I want to feel what he's feeling. You know what I mean? Rather than sitting there like, you know, like a bump on the log, you want to feel that kind of electricity that he had in his own experience of the word. So, you know, that's my case for reading aloud as a vehicle whereby we might inspire students to love to read. I welcome you to join the fray, and if you have a question or a comment, my lady will give you a microphone.
Raise your hand, please. Oh, yeah. Tim, one thing that struck me as you were speaking there that might help with some of our students who are more hesitant, perhaps, is that for people who are visually impaired, it's wonderful for them to have someone read to them.
Yes.
Because you know they hear the radio, they hear the television, but very often they too will miss the sound, the poetry of language that you're speaking to. And for our students, some of them to volunteer to be readers to visually impaired people may also develop that sense of understanding the language and conveying it to others.
Oh, I agree. Anytime you're obliged to read aloud, I think it can be helpful. Even if you're really thinking of it just as a job or a task that you're supposed to do to help someone, I think to the extent, well, I don't want to go into one of my mad rants, but I do think that there's a point at which the actual uttering of words, the actual reading aloud of words is a way of becoming more intimate with the fact and physicality of language. And to the extent that you become intimate with that, it changes your relationship to it, not only in terms of the offering aloud, but also to the semantic life in it. I mean, it just does, you know. And I often compare, Matt can bear witness to this, but the idea of English or any language is an instrument, and the same kind of virtuosity that a pianist might develop by hours and hours and hours of playing, it is not unlike what we might do if we read aloud a lot. It's a kind of intimacy with the instrument of the language, how it operates as a physical force in the ear and in our bodies beyond that. But it's also the idea that there are all these movements in both sonic and sonic in terms of vowels and consonants and so on, but also in terms of cadences that are more bodily felt, that are only witnessed in reading aloud. And again, not only in poems. I don't only mean in poems. I mean, I love prose. I love prose. And there's some beautiful stuff out there. And it too is alive, maybe more rhythmically than sonically if we compare it to poetry. But there's a life in the offering of language. And I think the more you do it, the more you feel it, you know? I just think that's true.
Hi. Well, as a college student, and I'm a sophomore in college right now, but I remember like in high school and in the classes I've taken, I've loved most of the books that I read because we did like small groups with students who didn't quite understand what they were reading, but they could like actually talk about it with other students and then go back to the teacher and tell them like what they learned and like what they thought about the story, because then they understood it listening to other people read it out loud and talk about how they felt about the poem or the story. So that's
yeah, that's a good idea too. Something I could have talked about, the idea of even beyond your own professorial action, you know, when students work together, reading together, or even looking at each other's work. That's another story. That also changes the dynamic of what you feel about words and reading.
Hi. Yeah, as a confirmation to your theory, I would like to tell you about my experiences in my literature classes where I insert videos of Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet, where he's reading the text while the students have that text out open in front of them. And these were the exact reactions of the students when they told me that they could relate to the emotion of the text more when they were able to actually hear it spoken or read out loud by a Shakespearean actor, as I can say. So there is your confirmation.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Bam. Yeah, no, and as I said, even texts that aren't necessarily intrinsically dramatic. I mean, I don't know if you think about Mills on Liberty. I don't know that it's intrinsically dramatic. I mean, the ideas are interesting, but the style is kind of, man, it's a little bit intimidating. But just hearing the way that, I don't know, I just think because so much of what is meant is in the inflections of the voice, I think hearing things aloud really just tunes the ear differently and therefore the mind. So it's something else.
I can share that
Sure.
I went to school long enough ago that we actually had records and recordings of things.
Sure, me too.
And there was a night when I had to read As You Like It, and I had to read the entire thing in one evening. So I went to the library and I put it on. And I listened to As You Like It at 45. And I remember, and it was really important because then I could hear when Shakespeare had made a joke. Ah! You know. But I do remember when I finished and I got back to my dorm, everyone sounded like that. Anyway, other thoughts?
So, Tim, it seems that you're likening the quality of an out loud reading to a brand of performance art, in a sense, and that the performer certainly has to have a certain level of enthusiasm.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And noticing certain crowd reactions, the sort of quiet reaction to the Mills reading, whereas a little bit of a subtle, almost silent chuckle when you got to Bugs Bunny. Mm-hmm. In our students' case, they can relate to those popular culture references a little more readily.
Sure.
Do you think it helps, or in your experience, to sort of contextualize Mills' rhetorical situation, his history, before going into that performance so that they don't necessarily feel intimidated by what sometimes comes across as a more stolid brand of reading?
Absolutely. I mean, when you get down to it, insofar as the students' understanding is concerned, the more context you can provide for anything, the better, really. I mean, I would, certainly, I guess there are times when you are obliged to just give a student a text and they have to deal with it before you give them much more. But I think ideally, that would always deepen the way someone read, assuming, of course, that they are interested to some extent by the way you contextualize the work. I mean, again, much of these ideas are built on the notion that there has to be some interest in what's going on. And I think if giving a context can increase the interest, by all means.
Yeah, sometimes to read the autobiography of Ben Franklin, it might behoove you to dress like Ben Franklin if you really want to get that job done.
You got somebody in the back.
It's obviously important that this whole concept starts at as young an age as possible.
I agree,
Okay?
yes.
And in dealing personally in an elementary classroom many moons ago, especially with special education kids, who kind of look at it as the biggest chore in the world, when you've got some peer kind of setting set up where there's a reward system put in place for these kids that reinforces the reading concept to not only the special kid, but the kid that's doing the reading with the special needs kid, and then being able to see that amongst the whole classroom. It just kind of sets up a whole situation where everybody joins in on the process, and it turns out to being fun.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Fun is a big plus always, especially for younger readers. I mean, we get older. Hopefully, we're able to, go along even if it's just hard work, as long as we have a frame to work with. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you can make it rewarding. I mean, depending, you were talking about special needs kids as well as kids who are, reading fine. I mean, yeah, there are many issues we might address if we talk about the young reader. For me, I was lucky. I mean, my mother liked to read to us. So by the time I was 3 or 4, I was already hooked on the idea that books were a magical place, like things happened in books that were really fascinating and all that. But I don't know if everyone gets that. I mean, I would say, of course, I imagine many of us in this room were people to whom are, people who were read to as children. But I don't know whether that's as common now as it once was. Speaking of early readers, I don't know. I imagine, God, I hope there are a lot of people who are still reading to, their little children. But I think it's also, and we can talk about this too, some of the obstacles between the love of reading or us or people in the love of reading. Certainly the video world and the television world and the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week aspect of it does not help to develop a certain love of words. Words compared to a television or compared to a video game, black words on a page look like relatively plain things. And if they're not imbued with the life that they deserve through someone's voice, man, you can easily see how students would very quickly, or young people would very quickly turn to the action-packed TV or the video game. And I do think that's a very different way of being conscious in the world. I mean, we can get into more philosophical things, but I do think, there are implications of all kinds. There's been some research, I think, according to Renee Orlander, that suggests that the actual eye muscles that we use to read are undeveloped if we spend too much time looking at screens. It just becomes less developed. So then the act of reading becomes physically more difficult. And so, boy, that's a scary thing, because that's not, I mean, you can repair, in some respects, an attitude or a perspective, but if your eyes are literally less able to do the work of reading, that seems pretty terrifying, really, because then we've kind of undone people for the pleasure of words. Other questions, comments?
Well, before I ask my question, I'll answer your question. And yes, children are still coming to school with thousands of hours of lap reading that their parents have given them. But my question is, you've mentioned how reading aloud, hearing lots of reading aloud as a child affected you. Did you also have a rich experience with hearing stories told and a rich background in music as well?
Well, I mean, probably not richer than many people. I mean, the stories that I was told were from books. I mean, you know, my mom would read.
So no oral storytelling
No,
tradition?
I did not grow up with someone saying, "Come here, I will spin you a yarn." Okay. No, I did not grow up with that at all. But in terms of music, I mean, you know, I have no idea how everyone else's parents were, but, you know, my mom would always have gospel blaring from the stereo on Sunday mornings. And the other days, the evenings anyway, my father would have, you know, jazz mostly, but some blues and some classical music on. So I mean, music was certainly part of my experience as a child, but I don't know if it was an extraordinary experience relative to any of you. We probably all had parents who listened to music, and you know, we liked some of it and some of it we didn't. I mean, my father, you know, to his credit, would in fact say sometimes, "Come in here for a minute, son. This is classical music. Sit your butt down and listen." I mean, you know, he would make me listen to it. And of course, you know, at the time I thought, "Oh man, what is this stuff?" You know? But bit by bit, of course, I take great pleasure in classical music now. It's probably rooted in those experiences. I don't know. And I think that's the other thing. I certainly am not of the school of thought that you can make someone be a good reader by making them sit down and read, but I do think that to some extent there is some of that, right? You got to be like, get your butt in there and hang with the words. So maybe there is some of that in teaching reading. I'm not sure it will teach you necessarily to love reading. I think there has to be that sense that in the text that one is given something that one cannot otherwise have. You know what I mean? I mean, if you read a story, or like that story Night, for example, which is a really troubling story you can tell about the death of a child. I've read that story a lot of times, and every time I get kind of caught up in this haunted atmosphere. I feel like I'm displaced in a way. And it's not that the feeling is fun. I wouldn't call it fun, but it's certainly a sense that there is a room of emotional experience that is given to me, an area in my mind, for lack of a better term, that is given to me by that story. In the same way, in some respects, that a good haunted house story would be. This is a kind of haunting, but much more subtle. And I think to the extent that reading can expand our sense of ourselves and our sense of what's possible in the world, or what might be felt. I could go into a crazy rant about, you know, poems and emotion, but I don't want to do that in this moment anyway. But to the extent that any text can expand the parameters of how we live in our emotional selves, I think that is a reward of sorts. I do think a story like Night is an adult's story. That would not be a story I would necessarily give to a child. But I think on that same continuum, like for example, my mom was very fond of reading The Billy Goat's Gruff. And I hear her voice in my head to this day. That has to be almost 50 years ago when she was reading that stuff to me. But The Billy Goat's Gruff was a pretty scary story for a little dude, you know? That troll was pretty rough, man. And so on that same continuum, I mean, that was troubling. I'm not sure it was fun exactly. I was glad when the Billy Goat, Big Billy Goat got the troll. But I think there's a dimension in which we want to feel enlivened, even in terms of anxiety, when we read something that's good. I mean, it's the reason people go to see things like, what's this series of movies where Death Wish, right? The Death Wish movies. I mean, people do look for other kinds of thrills. I'm not sure it's improving the level of discourse in our society, Death Wish, but whatever. Something else? Yeah, Renee?
Well, I just wanted to make a remark and give proper credit to Dr. Tom Soha, who in a talk last year on parent and child communications observed that the American Pediatric Association recommends no screens for children up to the age of 2 because of developmental things that it impedes. And at that talk, during the Q&A, a parent raised his hand and he said, if no screens before age 2, what are we supposed to do? So that was an interesting anecdotal little situation. But also, what about the young people who get to college and have missed out on loving to read? They don't love to read, and they're in introductory level classes, or they're in biology and they have cumbersome texts. And is there value in hearing those texts aloud? Or
depends. I would say I don't know. Gosh, I haven't read a biology text in a while. I imagine there are some passages that might be worth hearing, but even if the biology text is extremely dry, I would like to think that that in the array of classes that a student would take, there would be some reading aloud that would be very valuable, and that the interest in reading therefore would transfer to other texts. Like, for example, I do not take the same pleasure in Mill that I do in James Baldwin, for example. I mean, I don't take the same pleasure in it, but I'm probably a better reader of Mill because I heard someone read it aloud. But I don't know that I'd ever say, I love Mill's style, I love it. I don't know that I could love his style. I admire the thinking. And the only way I got to that point was because someone, through over years and different experiences, I was given a chance to hear the value in what was being read there. But I don't know. I mean, that's why I said initially, if you're teaching chemistry, I don't know how many passages in a chemistry text would make for a really rich reading. There probably are some. I don't know. I have not taught chemistry, right? But I would just say that hopefully, if the student has also been obliged to take history, English of various kinds, that there will be enough experience at the college level that they would have been encountered, reading aloud to the extent that it might have hopefully inspired a deeper interest, generally speaking, in reading. But no, I don't know if we can ever figure out a way to make students thrill to every text. I just don't know. I mean, truthfully, when I have to read something that's strictly scientific or something, I mean, I'm interested in the ideas. I'm not sure I'm thrilled by the feeling of it. It's much more, it's a cooler kind of reading. But I think the way we get to that kind of reading, because I can read scientific texts and enjoy it. I've been reading a few things about the evolution of language, for example, which it's not beautiful or emotionally rich, but the ideas are there. But I think we get to a place where we can enjoy the ideas in a text by having been moved to value reading through like other and earlier texts. For example, if we listen to Dr. Seuss' Green Eggs and Ham as little kids, I mean, even now it's fun, of course. But as kids, certainly probably no one would make much of a case that Green Eggs and Ham or The Cat in the Hat teach you valuable life lessons. I don't know, maybe in some way, but mostly it is the pleasure of hearing rhythms and rhymes and crazy things happening, the adventure of it. I'm not sure you become more moral because of Green Eggs and Ham, or a better potential student because of that. But I think to the extent that we find ourselves enthralled or thrilled or pleased by text at whatever stage of our lives, certainly as children, as my man suggests, that's the easiest way to get the door open, because kids don't know to resist. They don't have any resistance. They're like, okay, that, and they go. But if we think about the college student who in some cases may have had a negative experience with reading and may not be a very good reader, I do think to the extent that we find texts of whatever sort that involve some kind of thrill or some kind of payoff, for lack of a better word, I mean, if the student hears it and the light goes on, it means, for me anyway, I think it means it's that much more likely that he or she will approach the next text with a little bit more ferocity or with a little more general thirst. As I said, so much changed for me in hearing how other people understood things, like how a text lives inside someone else, how it lives there, and you think, man, I want that life in me. I mean, because I do think that even someone who's had a relatively rough time of it in terms of their reading experience, they're still thirsty for life. They're still thirsty for whatever goods they can come by, right? And so if they witness someone having a great time with a poem or a great time with a personal essay, there's then a chance, at least, that spark will transfer to, well, I want to get what they had. I mean, I think, for example, now again, I'm speaking as someone who's a writer who probably loved words from the time I was really little, for reasons both my mother was involved in and also because probably just my own mania as a kid. But I remember, speaking of the literary festival, I remember when I was a freshman, or I guess I was a freshman, and they had a literary festival at Southern Methodist University. And it was my first time hearing professional artists, literary artists read. And even though so often I was a little bit behind the curve on understanding everything that was being read, man, the whole idea that there was this way that one would offer language and things would just out of thin air occur and be felt. I mean, to this day, I've never gotten over it. I've never gotten over it. I do think that, therefore, there is some value in that, in the literary festival experience for anyone, in the sense that maybe it's only intuitive, but you begin to recognize that language is a vehicle through which we conjure the world to some extent, right? It's like a magic thing. It's a magic vehicle, right? A lobster playing a violin. Like, you can just say that, right? And people are like, a lobster playing a violin. It's impossible, but conceptually, for a moment, you hold it in your head. It's like pulling a rabbit out of the hat, right? And so I think when you get that sense of what language can do, I think it moves you to be in heavier pursuit of those possibilities. Again, we're talking about the love of reading now, not just the practical act and ability to read. I think, man, again, if someone thinks reading is crap, and it's silly, I don't care what techniques you apply to them, they're probably not going to learn to read very well or care very much about it. But I do think once one has been touched by something, it's very difficult not to want to be touched again or to feel a certain sense of recognition again in that way. And as I said, certainly reading a physics text would be very different from reading a sonnet. Of course it would be. But we hope that to the extent that one is electrified by a sonnet, one would bring hopefully that much more energy to the possibility of the physics text, you know what I mean? But yeah, all writing doesn't have the same goal. I mean, I would never say, you will love Shakespeare, you will love Stephen Hawking the same way. I don't know. I mean, you can love them, you can love both of them, but you love them for different reasons. But it's only by, I think, at first, and I'm sorry if I'm being repetitive, but you first have to impress upon a person the possibility that there's something really there that you will love, that you can have if you give yourself to this process we call reading. If people don't believe that, then you can't get much further, I don't think. I don't think there's any amount of intimidation that can make people better readers. I just don't believe it. You can quiz people till their heads cave in. It's not going to make them better readers. They have to, at some point, really think reading matters to them and that it can give them something important.
Hi, you've talked a lot about taking a piece of, kind of bringing out the voice of reading by reading something aloud. Do you find the same is true in teaching writing, that having students read their own work aloud can improve their own voice?
Absolutely.
And connect to
yeah,
that?
Absolutely. I mean, even though this is ostensibly strictly about loving to read, but yeah, absolutely. I think when someone looks at their work on the page, for example, I mean, they have an idea of it, they wrote it, it's their work, they see it, but when it is in the air, it's a kind of publication, right? It's, for a moment, it is published in the ears of all who are present. And I think it does two things. One is it reminds them that, you know, I did this. People are hearing what I am doing and being in some way changed by it. And secondly, I think, how's the best way to put it? I think it makes them hear themselves almost as a separate thing apart. I mean, in other words, the act of, I probably didn't say that quite right, but the act of giving voice to one's own work, I think changes your relationship to the work and to your own mind. You know, and this is why I'll often say, you know, read aloud, read your stuff aloud, read it aloud as much as you can. Read other people aloud too, but read yourself, your own things aloud too. I mean, because it is, and if we're talking about writing, poetry in particular, but writing in general, if you want to be a writer, you're really learning how to you're trying to find out how language fits your own being. I mean, we all have different rhythms in us and sensibilities, and that's what gives rise to style. You know, we all have these different aspects in our minds and hearts. And at some point, we start to make choices about what rings best in us. So, but again, if you really want to be a writer, I think you're already halfway to becoming a good reader, because I think you'll find that you have to be a good reader to be a good writer. If only everyone wanted to be a writer, that would solve half of our problems, right? But no, I think, that being what it may be, I still think we are able to impart some real electricity to students and to each other, of course, for that matter, through text as we read them aloud. Other questions, concerns, comments, open hostilities?
Well, let me please then thank Tim very much for speaking, and invite all of you 2 weeks from today, right here, same bat channel. Jennifer Youngkin is going to be speaking about motivating students, faculty as advisors. So thank you very much, Tim.
And thank you very much. And I've got some literary festival schedules. I will put them over on the table. So you, by all means, disseminate, freely.